Welcome to Sleep by Story. Tonight, you're not just listening to a story. You're stepping into a quiet world made of whispers, memory, and the gentle unraveling of a soul. If this story helps you find rest, peace, or even a little comfort in the dark, remember to subscribe before you drift off. That way, your next journey will always be waiting, right here, whenever you need it. Now, find your pillow, let your body relax, and let your thoughts fade. It's time to begin. It began with a phone call, not a dramatic one. No screaming, no crying, no thunder in the background. Just the sterile, too calm voice of a woman who introduced herself as Clara from Rosewood County Administration. Mr. Elias Mercer, speaking. I'm calling in regard to your father, Thomas Mercer. I'm sorry to inform you. He passed away 4 days ago. We tried reaching you sooner. There were complications. Elias blinked at the ceiling, lying in bed, though it was already past 10 in the morning. His apartment was quiet, as always. Just the hum of the refrigerator from the other room, and the occasional creak of wood settling in the walls. He hadn't spoken to his father in nearly 7 years. Not a word. Not since the day he packed his things into a dented blue Honda and drove out of the house with shaking hands and a promise never to return. And now the man was dead, just like that. No arguments left to finish. No apologies coming, just silence. Clara went on, her voice rehearsed, distant, almost apologetic. There's a small property up in Rosewood Ridge, a cabin. It's yours by law. He left a key at the station, and, well, someone should probably go up there. Elias wanted to say no, wanted to say sell it, burn it, give it to someone else. But instead, he just said, text me the address. That night, sleep didn't come, not the kind that sticks. He drifted, surfaced, drifted again. In those hazy hours between 2 and 4 a.m., the past came knocking like wind tapping on old windows. His father's voice, stern, quiet, and heavy with things never said. The sound of boots on the cabin floor. The way the woods looked just before sunset, gold slicing through the trees like fire. And the silence, the heavy, endless silence that used to live between them. By morning, the decision had been made. He packed a bag, light, just the essentials, and set out on the road. The highway north was long and straight. A thin ribbon of black stretched across miles of fading farmland. Every few exits brought the same gas stations, the same lonely diners with flickering signs. Elias barely noticed. The hum of the tires on asphalt had become a kind of lullaby. Somewhere around hour 2, the city began to dissolve. Billboards turned into trees. Traffic thinned. He rolled the windows down, letting in the scent of pine and cold dirt. The air tasted different here. Older, maybe, less filtered. It reminded him of camping trips he used to take before his mother got sick. He didn't listen to music, just the road. He wanted to hear the world think. By hour 4, the terrain shifted. The land began to rise in slow, gentle waves. The trees grew thicker. Towns grew smaller. In a place called Willow's End, he stopped for coffee. A gas station that looked like it hadn't updated its prices since the early 2000s. Inside, an old man nodded to him but said nothing. There was a warmth in that silence, oddly comforting. It made him wonder how many things in life didn't actually need to be said out loud. Back in the car, steam rising from a cheap paper cup, Elias glanced at the GPS. Another 90 minutes to go. He tapped the wheel. His father had driven this road, many times probably, with groceries, with tools, with whatever people needed when they lived far from anyone else. Elias tried to picture him here, not as the man who raised him, but as a person. A man with routines. A man who bought gas and coffee, and maybe stopped on the side of the road sometimes, just to watch the deer. But memory is rarely so kind. Mostly, he remembered the silence, the weight of things not said, the rooms filled with tension, the absence of a mother's laughter after she was gone. Just as the sun began its descent, low, orange and soft, he turned onto a narrow, winding road with no name. The trees here leaned in close. Their branches touched overhead, like fingers reaching for each other. The road cracked and buckled under time, forcing him to drive slow. Finally, at the top of a long hill, the cabin appeared. Small, wooden, slightly crooked, like it had leaned too long into the wind. But there it was, just as he remembered. The porch light still worked, glowing dim against the growing dusk. He parked and stepped out. For a moment, he didn't move, just listened. Birdsong, the wind, and underneath it all, stillness. The kind of stillness that only lives far from cities. The kind that forces you to hear your own heartbeat. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old brass key Clara had mailed overnight. It felt heavier than expected. Or maybe it was just the memory wrapped around it. Inside, the cabin was exactly what it should be. Dust-covered furniture, stacks of books, faded photographs in frames that hadn't been touched in years. Everything was quiet, untouched, preserved like the inside of a snow globe, waiting for someone to shake it. On the mantel, a photo of his parents, younger, smiling, back when everything still made sense. He sat down in the old armchair by the window, the fabric rough against his fingers, and for the first time in years, he let the silence in, not to fight it, not to fear it, just to listen. And somewhere in that silence was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. But it was there, waiting. The morning came slowly. Elias woke with a kind of confusion that only happens in unfamiliar places, eyes opening to strange shadows, unfamiliar creaks, and the faint scent of old wood and colder air. It took a moment to remember where he was. The cabin, his father's cabin. Sunlight slipped in through thin curtains, slicing across the floor in narrow golden stripes. Dust danced in the beams, slowly drifting like tiny thoughts with nowhere to land. The silence was thicker in the morning. He could hear his own breath. Every heartbeat felt louder than usual. He stretched, muscles stiff from a night spent in the worn armchair by the window. He hadn't even made it to the bedroom. After splashing cold water on his face in the bathroom, which still had the same cracked mirror from childhood, he stepped into the small kitchen. The cupboards held only a few items: some canned soup, stale crackers, instant coffee. He boiled water, poured the powder in, and stood with both hands wrapped around the mug, watching the trees outside. Something about being here made time feel slow, almost like it had never left the 1990s. No phone buzzed, no email pings, just the occasional creak of wood, the wind brushing through pine. He took his coffee into the living room and stood staring at the fireplace. That's when he noticed the floor. There was a section just in front of the hearth, slightly discolored, the wood planks not perfectly aligned. It caught his eye not because it was obvious, but because it wasn't. It was too careful. He knelt down and ran his fingers across the edges. A faint groove, a subtle shift in texture. The planks didn't quite match. He pressed along the seam once, twice. Then a soft click responded under his hand. One of the boards moved slightly. Not loose, but placed intentionally. He slipped his fingers beneath the edge and lifted it with care. Beneath was a shallow space carved into the floor, just deep enough to hold a box. Wrapped in a linen cloth, the box was old, the leather dry and cracking at the corners. Inside, he found 3 items: a small notebook bound in brown leather, a faded black and white photograph, and a silver locket hanging on a long black string. He laid them out in front of him, cross-legged on the wooden floor. The air felt still around him, like the cabin was holding its breath. The photograph showed a woman standing in front of a dusty old car, smiling, squinting into the sun. Desert hills stretched out behind her. He flipped it over. On the back, in delicate cursive, was a name and date. Anna, April 1968. The name didn't mean anything to him. Not yet. He turned the locket in his palm. Simple, oval-shaped, smooth silver. He opened it. No picture. Just a small dried flower pressed inside. A daisy, perfectly preserved. Its petals the color of time. He opened the notebook. The first few pages were blank. Then, on the 4th page, a line written in fine handwriting. November 3rd, 1994. The silence is too loud today. I walked the ridge trail. The lake is freezing early this year. I saw her again. Just the edge of her coat disappearing into the trees. Elias raised an eyebrow. The writing didn't match his father's. It was neater, more delicate. The ink faded slightly with age. He turned the page. November 5th. There are dreams I can't wake from. They leave a fog in my head. I hear her voice in the morning sometimes, like she's calling me from the old well. The entries continued, irregularly dated, sometimes just days apart, sometimes months. Some were short, others filled the page. The tone drifted between gentle and frantic. The name Thomas appeared again and again, always written the same way. not with anger, with longing. He kept reading. Sometimes he looks at me like I'm not real, like he's afraid I'll disappear again. But I always come back when the snow falls, always in November. The sun shifted through the cabin windows as the day slipped by. Time moved slowly here, but it moved all the same. Shadows stretched across the room as he read deeper into the notebook, turning pages like peeling back the layers of someone else's life. There was sadness in the words, and something else he couldn't name. Not grief, not madness, but something close to both. The entries started to thin near the end. The last one was short. November 19th, 1996. I buried the key. That was it. No explanation. No follow-up. He stared at the line until it began to blur. He didn't know what key she meant, or why she had written it with such finality. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The notebook rested on his lap. His thoughts wandered. The wind brushed against the cabin, a slow, steady rhythm like breath. That night, in the upstairs loft beneath the angled ceiling, Elias lay awake longer than he expected. The bed creaked with every shift. The blankets smelled faintly of cedar and old fabric. And just as he began to drift, he heard it. A soft sound. A creak, far below, near the fireplace. He held his breath. Waited. But the sound didn't come again. Only the wind. Only the trees. Only the silence that now seemed full of something else. Morning arrived with the scent of damp pine. The cabin breathed with the forest. It expanded and settled like a living thing. Elias lay still in bed, eyes open, watching the ceiling as the sunlight pushed gently through the window beside him. He hadn't dreamt. Or if he had, the dreams dissolved too quickly to leave behind shapes. Only a soft ache in his chest remained, like a story someone else had started and never finished. Downstairs, the fireplace was cold. The air had that quiet stillness of early hours, when even the birds seemed to whisper. He brewed coffee slowly, listening to the water hiss in the kettle, his movements precise, deliberate. The world here didn't rush. After breakfast, he gathered the notebook, the photograph, and the locket, setting them carefully into a side pocket of his coat. The words I buried, the key echoed in his mind. He wasn't sure why, but the phrase had settled deep inside him, like a needle threading its way through something long forgotten. The lake was only a short walk away, if he still remembered the trail. He stepped outside. The air was crisp, not quite cold, but filled with the earthy scent of leaves and soil. A thin layer of dew coated the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker knocked gently against a tree. He followed the narrow path that led away from the cabin, past the old well, now covered with a rusted grate, and into the woods. The trail had once been more defined. Years ago, it had been a dirt path wide enough for a wheelbarrow. Now, branches reached across it, ferns curled in from the edges, and roots rose like old bones from beneath the soil. Still, his feet remembered the way. The forest here was thick, Tall pines blocked much of the sky, their needles muting sound like velvet curtains. Every so often, he'd catch a flicker of movement, a bird darting overhead, a squirrel disappearing into brush. But mostly, it was just trees. Endless, waiting trees. About 20 minutes in, the woods opened up, and there it was. The lake. It sat like a mirror, carved into the earth long still, reflecting the gray sky above. Along its far side, reeds swayed gently. A line of birch trees stood pale and thin, like ghosts keeping watch. Elias stepped to the shore, the ground soft beneath his boots. The lake hadn't changed. It still had that hush about it, as if even nature held its breath here. He knelt and touched the water, cold, still, perfectly clear. He stood and looked around. If a key had been buried, where would someone choose? He scanned the shoreline. Rocks, moss, small patches of muddy sand. Then he noticed it a clearing on the left, partially hidden by the curve of the hill. Not large, just a space where the trees gave way to sky and the ground seemed hollow. He walked toward it. The clearing was no more than 15 feet wide, but something about it felt purposeful. There was no underbrush, no logs or fallen branches, just earth, soft, dark, undisturbed. He paused in the center. In his pocket, the notebook pressed lightly against his side, as if reminding him, "I buried the key." He dropped to his knees. There were no tools, only his hands. The first few inches were easy, loose soil, damp, full of roots. Then the earth resisted, compacted tight. He kept digging. A root snagged his finger. He pulled back, hissing softly, wiping the dirt on his coat. But just as he leaned back in, his fingers brushed something different. Wood, flat, smooth. He cleared more of the soil. A box. It wasn't large, roughly the size of a shoebox, made of dark oak, weathered but intact. No lock, just a simple lid, fitted tightly. He lifted it slowly. Inside were folded papers, brittle with age, a small glass bottle, corked, a rolled piece of faded blue cloth, and beneath them all, at the bottom of the box, was another key. It was nothing like the one to the cabin. This one was old, iron, heavy, ornate, with a twisted stem and a worn loop at the top. He held it up to the light. Whatever it unlocked, it wasn't modern. He turned back to the papers. They were letters, dozens of them, written in the same handwriting as the notebook. Each one addressed simply, Thomas. He sat down, cross-legged, and unfolded the first. July 9th, 1987. You were quiet again today. I wish I could understand what lies behind your eyes when you disappear like that. I saw you at the edge of the trees after dusk, standing like a shadow. You never came inside, but I waited. The next one, October 2nd, 1988. You said I was only real in November. I asked if that meant I was a ghost the rest of the year. You didn't answer. I'm not sure you know. I'm not sure I know. And another, April 23rd, 1990. The key is old. I found it in the drawer by the radio, under the map. It feels important, like it belongs to something buried too deep to find. You told me not to touch it. I didn't listen. Elias read 5 letters before the weight of them pressed too hard against his ribs. He set the rest back in the box, gently. The key was cold in his hand. He sat by the lake until the sun passed its peak, the sky softening from white to pale blue. The trees whispered in their own language, leaves brushing like old pages. He stood and looked back toward the trail. There was no place he knew that matched this key. Not in the cabin, not in the shed behind it. He would have remembered a lock this old, this particular. Which meant there was something he hadn't found yet. Back at the cabin, the wind picked up. The door groaned slightly when he pushed it open. He placed the box on the table. Then he searched. Every drawer, every closet. He lifted rugs, checked behind paintings, tapped walls and floorboards. Nothing. Until he reached the attic. The pull-string light clicked on, revealing a low-ceilinged space filled with dust and boxes, old tools, a trunk of blankets, a wooden ladder leaning against the wall. And in the far corner, hidden behind a tall cabinet, was a door, not a room door, smaller, chest height, square, metal hinges. He approached slowly, heart beginning to tap louder in his ears. The iron key fit perfectly. The lock clicked with a soft scrape. He pulled the door open. Inside was a narrow shaft, descending into darkness. A wooden staircase spiraled down, edges worn smooth with age. He hesitated only a moment. Then he stepped inside. The air was cool, damp. The sound of his own breathing was the only companion. The stairs groaned with every step. At the bottom, a room, stone walls, earth floor, and in the center a chair. Empty, facing a wall with nothing on it. But beside the chair, on a small table, sat a tape recorder, a stack of cassette tapes, and a candle, long since burned out. He turned one of the tapes over, labeled November 3rd, 1994, the same date as the first journal entry. He brought the recorder upstairs. He didn't listen that night. Instead, he lit the fire, sat by the window, and watched the trees sway against the dark. The morning light crept across the floor, casting long shapes over the worn wooden boards. Elias opened his eyes slowly. The ceiling above him felt unfamiliar. He lay still for a while, listening. The cabin made soft noises as it adjusted to the changing air. A slight creak in the beams, a sigh through the windows, and the occasional rattle from an old vent. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. The blanket had fallen halfway off his body. His neck ached from sleeping at an angle. It took him a moment to remember where he was. The cabin. His father's old cabin. And yesterday's discoveries still echoed in his mind. The notebook, the letters. The key. He rose and stretched. Outside the loft window, the sky was pale blue, covered in a thin layer of morning cloud. The trees stood still, waiting for wind that hadn't yet arrived. He dressed slowly, layering up against the forest chill that never quite left this place, even in late spring. Downstairs, the fireplace was dark. The ashes were cool. He didn't bother lighting it again. Instead, he filled the kettle, lit the old stove, and waited. He poured the water over instant coffee, watching the granules swirl into the dark. The smell was bitter but warm. It reminded him of long trips and early mornings from years ago. He opened the front door and stepped out into the clearing. The world was quiet. The dew still clung to blades of grass. Somewhere to his right, a bird called out once, then stopped. Everything seemed paused, as if the forest, too, was remembering something. Elias had come here to gather what his father left behind, but the longer he stayed, the less he was sure what that even meant. There were no instructions, no explanations, only fragments. He zipped his jacket, slipped the small notebook into his pocket, and began to walk toward the trees. The trail to the lake was narrower than he remembered, overgrown in places, bent with fallen branches. But his feet followed the old rhythm, around the thick cedar stump, past the crooked pine that leaned over the trail, through the thin curtain of vines that brushed his shoulders. The forest was different in the morning, less mysterious, but not less quiet. He moved through it slowly, taking care where he stepped. Each patch of moss, each root, each stone underfoot felt like a thread in a larger fabric, and he was moving across it without knowing the pattern. After 20 minutes, the trees pulled back and the lake appeared. It sat calm and wide, its surface glassy and pale. A thin mist hovered above the water, curling upward like breath. On the far side, the trees stood in close formation, their white bark catching the light. Elias stepped to the edge of the water and crouched. He dipped his fingers into the lake. It was colder than he expected. He stood and looked around. The shoreline curved gently left, leading to a break in the trees. He followed it. A few more minutes, and he reached a small clearing he had nearly forgotten. There were no signs that anyone had stood here in years, but something about it felt tended. Not recently, perhaps, but with purpose. Elias scanned the ground. The earth here was softer, the soil darker. He dropped to his knees and brushed aside the surface leaves. His fingers worked slowly through the dirt. The first few inches gave easily. Beneath that, the soil grew heavier. Then something caught his touch. A corner. Wood, not stone. He cleared more space. A box, small and rectangular, rested inside a shallow depression in the ground. He lifted it carefully, dirt still clinging to its surface. The wood was old but strong. It had been protected from the worst of the weather. The lid fit snug, not locked, just pressed shut. He opened it. Inside were a handful of folded papers, browned with age, and beneath them, a small iron key. Heavy, detailed, cold to the touch. He held it up and turned it in his hand. It didn't belong to the cabin. That much he was sure of. He turned his attention to the papers. Letters, each folded and sealed with care. All addressed to the same person. To Thomas, his father. He unfolded one and read slowly. You stood by the porch again last night. I watched from the trees, too far to call your name. I waited for you to speak. You never did. I wonder if you still remember the sound of my voice. He read another. The key is hidden now, not out of fear, but because you forget. Every time the leaves change, you forget. And when the snow comes, I return, and you ask why I stay. I stay because something here still remembers me. Elias paused. He glanced at the key again. These letters were written by the same person who had kept the notebook. Anna, the woman in the photograph, the one his father had never spoken of. He placed the letters back into the box. His fingers curled around the key once more. It felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of both memory and silence. He walked back slowly, the key in his pocket. The sky was brighter now, the mist beginning to lift. A breeze passed through the trees, soft but steady, brushing the leaves with quiet hands. Back at the cabin, he stepped inside and set the box on the table. The silence of the room welcomed him again, patient and watchful. He poured the last of his coffee and sat in the chair by the fireplace. He studied the key. Then he rose and walked to the hallway near the stairs. There, tucked between the main floor and the attic, was a narrow closet. He had opened it yesterday and found nothing but dust and old coats. But now, with new eyes, he looked again. At the back of the closet, just above the floor, was a small square outline. A panel set into the wall, barely noticeable. He reached forward and pressed. It shifted slightly. He ran his fingers along the edges. There was a keyhole. He tried the key. It fit. The mechanism clicked, dry and low. The panel opened outward, revealing a short, dark tunnel that led to a descending stairwell. He ducked and stepped inside. The air was cold, stale, filled with the smell of stone and wood. He followed the stairs downward. They were narrow, carved directly into the foundation. After a dozen steps, the stairway opened into a hidden basement room. The walls were lined with shelves. Most were empty, but a few held jars, old tools, and boxes labeled with faded ink. In the center of the room stood a small wooden table. On it sat a single object, a tape recorder, the kind with buttons that clicked loudly, with dials worn smooth from use. Next to it, a stack of cassette tapes, each labeled with a date. He picked one up, November 3rd, 1994. The same as the first entry in the notebook. Elias sat on a low stool beside the table. He reached out, placed the tape into the machine, and pressed play. The tape clicked and began to spin. For a moment, there was only static. Then a voice. You told me not to record my thoughts. You said writing was safer, but I can't sleep. The nights are long. The dreams keep coming back, and I need to hear my own voice, even if you never listen. It was a woman's voice, clear, gentle, a little hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in a while. Elias leaned forward. I walked to the lake again today. I saw the ripples, but nothing moved. The sky was gray. The cold is settling early. You didn't speak when I came home. I'm not sure you saw me. Or maybe you did, and just didn't want to look. He paused the tape. He sat in silence for a long while. The room felt different now. Not haunted, not dark, but dense. Like it held layers of time, pressed together. He placed the tape back onto the stack and chose another. A few days later, he played it. I heard your voice through the walls. You called a name that wasn't mine. I stood outside the attic and listened. You were crying. You never cry. Not even when she died, but I heard you. I wonder if you thought I would answer. Elias stopped the recorder again. He turned the key in his pocket, slowly, between his fingers. Back upstairs, he opened the window to let in the afternoon breeze. The forest was breathing again. He sat by the fire, not lighting it, just watching the way the light moved across the walls. That evening, he sat with the tapes and listened to 3 more. He didn't take notes. He didn't stop to interpret. He just listened. The voice spoke of memories, of cold nights, of growing distance, of names once whispered but now forgotten, of days where she walked among trees, leaving no footprints, of the ache that came when no one asked where she had been. As the sun disappeared and the sky turned to ash, Elias sat alone in the quiet cabin. The fire had not been lit, yet he did not feel cold. In the dark, he held the key. And for the first time since his father's death, he realized this trip had not been about collecting what was left behind. It had been about unlocking what was never shared. The shop closed at 6 p.m., not because of customers. There rarely were any, but because that's when the sun dipped just below the rooftops, and the light across the wooden floor grew long and gold. That was his signal that the day had folded into its quiet half, and silence could take the lead. He placed the small, closed sign in the window, even though no one was watching. Then, with practiced ease, he dusted the counters, wound the clocks once more, and turned the dials to rest. 100 tiny ticking hearts slowing down, until only the big grandfather clock remained. That one he let run. Its voice was deep, like thunder held at a distance. Upstairs, the house felt colder. Night always moved faster there. He lit a single candle in the hallway, not for light, but for the shape of the flame, for the way it danced without moving from its place. That reminded him of her. He stepped into the living room, where the armchair sat just a few inches off center from the fireplace, the way she had always left it. Because, she said, perfect symmetry is a little too perfect. He sat, placed the mug of tea, his second of the day, on the table. Still warm, still herbal, still familiar. He looked at the mantel, at the old small frame with a photograph so faded you could barely make out the smile. But he remembered it anyway. He didn't need light to recall what light had once shown. The room creaked softly, as if stretching before sleep. The wind outside had calmed. Only a faint sigh brushing against the window pane remained. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, not yet, but to let the day settle, like dust in an old library. He listened to nothing, to everything, to the echo of the clocks below ticking not for time, but for memory. And there, in the quiet space between 2 seconds, he whispered, "Maybe tomorrow we'll fix the chiming one," though he knew he wouldn't. But it was nice to pretend. The candle flickered, the tea cooled, and the lamp, that same one at the end of the hallway, still burned. It always did. Even when he forgot, even when sleep found him before he reached the bed, even when dreams came without warning. It glowed, soft, steady, patient, a witness to a quiet man's quiet life. And when the world outside gave in to the deep blue of night, Mr. Hoffner did not speak. He simply breathed and let the silence take care of the rest.